All right, diving right in today, we're tackling the Paris Agreement, and you've given us a mountain of material.
Oh, yeah, definitely want to get to the bottom of this.
Clearly, you want the need to know, not to be drowning in info, right?
Right.
So think of this as our map through the maze of climate action, global style.
Love that.
So first things first, what prevents the Paris Agreement, and why should anyone even care?
Okay, well, the Paris Agreement, it's a big deal. It's a treaty, international, legally binding, all about climate change.
We're talking serious stuff here.
Yeah, 196 countries adopted it back in 2015, and it was huge because for the first time, almost every nation on Earth, they agreed, actually agreed on a shared goal.
Which is?
To fight climate change, specifically by limiting global warming, keeping it well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees compared to, pre-industrial levels.
That 1.5 number, we hear it everywhere.
Yeah.
But each country, they set their own goals to get there, right?
Right. Those are the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs.
NBCs, gotta love an acronym.
Basically, each country figures out how much they can cut their greenhouse gas emissions, depending on their situation.
Makes sense. But are those goals even enough? Is everyone aiming high enough?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And how often do they even revisit these NDCs? Is this a one-time thing?
Think of it like leveling up, in a climate action game. Every 5 years, new plans, hopefully more ambitious each time.
Ooh, I like that analogy. So it's ongoing, not just a one-off.
Exactly. And to keep everyone honest, there's this thing called the global stocktake.
Global stocktake? What's that?
Every 5 years, everyone checks in, see how we're doing, are we on track? Spoiler alert, the first one, well...
Uh-oh. Doesn't sound good.
Let's just say Ani Dasgupta from the World Resources Institute called it a damning report card.
Ouch.
Emissions still going up, rich countries not paying what they promised, adaptation efforts way behind.
Not exactly a glowing review. But before we spiral into despair, were there any bright spots, anything positive in that report?
Oh, absolutely. Renewables, solar, wind, booming. Electric vehicles, same thing. And some countries, they're passing some pretty big climate laws.
Okay, so it's not all bleak. We've got some progress mixed with some not so great news.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag for sure.
But I'm curious, how do countries even figure out these NDCs in the first place? It can't be random, right?
No, not random at all. It's a whole process. They start by looking at their emissions, right now. Where are they at? They make these detailed inventories, breaking it down by source, like energy, transport, agriculture, and then by sector, like industry, homes, the whole shebang.
So they get a clear picture of where those emissions are coming from. Makes sense. Then what?
Then they look at their vulnerability, to climate change. What areas need adapting, like protecting coastlines from rising sea levels, developing drought-resistant crops, that kind of thing.
Sounds like a major risk assessment.
It is. And they consider international commitments, the latest climate science, those IPCC reports. Everyone's got to be on the same page.
Checking their work against the global context. Got it.
And a big part of it is fairness, equity. You have to factor in a country's economic situation, their history with emissions. It's a balancing act.
Right, what they can contribute, but also acknowledging, their responsibility.
Exactly. And they don't do this alone. It's collaborative. They work with everyone. Government, industry, scientists, civil society groups. Everyone has a voice.
Wow, a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
It's got to be realistic and effective.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together. So they've got these plans, then what?
They officially submit their NDCs to the UNFCCC, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, outlining their targets and how they'll reach them.
Sounds pretty official.
And remember those 5-year cycles. They update their NDCs each time, aiming higher.
Always striving for improvement. That's good. Now, we've talked a lot about governments, but what about businesses? Are there tools for them to get on board with this Paris Agreement?
There is. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI for short, helps companies set targets for cutting emissions that are aligned with, what the Paris Agreement is trying to achieve.
So businesses are in the game too. But how do we even know if all these national targets, these company initiatives, will actually keep warming below that 1.5 or even 2 degrees?
That's where it gets complicated. We rely on these climate models, really sophisticated, but...
There's always a but.
They have limitations. We're talking huge amounts of data, complex algorithms trying to simulate the entire Earth's systems, the atmosphere, oceans, land, everything interacts.
So even with today's computing power, it's still a challenge.
Massive challenge. Plus, Earth's climate system is incredibly complex, like how do you predict cloud formations or permafrost thawing? Those feedback loops are tough to model.
So there's uncertainty built into these models.
There is. Our long-term projections, they come with a range of possible outcomes. Plus, there's the tech side. Renewables are advancing fast, but they're not ready to completely replace fossil fuels globally, not yet.
So we need breakthroughs, scientific and technological, to hit these targets, huh?
You got it. And it's not JST technology, it's global coordination, effective policies.
Yeah.
Each country has its own stuff going on, priorities, resources, politics.
Trying to get everyone on the same page while also being fair sounds impossible.
It's incredibly complex. Plus, there's the economic angle. Switching from fossil fuels, that requires massive investment, new infrastructure, changing entire industries.
So are we talking potential job losses too?
That's a concern, definitely. We need solutions for job creation, retraining, economic diversification.
This is a puzzle with like a million pieces. Science, tech, economics, politics, and even like social change, how people behave. We need everyone on board making sustainable choices, and that's
a massive challenge globally. You're not wrong. It's a challenge that requires everyone working together like we've never seen before.
And all this ties back to those NDCs we talked about earlier. All right, before we dive deeper, let's go back to the SBTI, the Initiative for Businesses. Do they use those same climate models with all those limitations?
They do. Even the SBTI, which is supposed to be science-based, has to make assumptions, work with data that's not always perfect.
So even there's uncertainty.
There is. For example, you need to know a company's past emissions, but good historical data, that can be hard to come by. Plus, there's estimating the remaining global carbon budget, how much we can emit before we hit those temperature limits.
And that depends on, climate sensitivity?
Exactly. And that's still a bit of a mystery, how sensitive the climate is to those emissions.
So even with good intentions and the best science, we're still working with incomplete information.
We are.
What other assumptions does the SBTI have to make?
Well, they assume that a company's emissions estimates are accurate, but getting that data, especially from their supply chain, it's not easy.
So even the starting point, the data itself, might be off.
It can be. And then they use average carbon intensity for a sector, but that data is often messy, different sources, regional differences, you know it.
So SBTI, aiming for science-based, but still grappling with these real-world limitations.
It's the paradox, right? But despite all that, it pushes companies to take action. It's a step in the right direction.
Transparency, accountability, even if it's not perfect, it's better than nothing.
Absolutely.
Speaking of specifics, what about the U.S.'s NDC? What are they aiming for?
The U.S., they're aiming for 52% emissions reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Big goal, net zero by 2050.
Big goals indeed. Are they actually on track to meet those targets, though?
Well, the Climate Action Tracker, they say the U.S.'s current policies, insufficient.
Oof, not a great. What about China? They're a major player in all of this.
China's pledged to peak emissions before 2030, carbon neutrality by 2060.
Sounds ambitious, but are they actually doing what it takes to get there?
They're investing heavily in renewables, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, all that. But their NDC, it's a little vague on some things.
Like what?
How they'll deal with emissions from agriculture, for one.
So big goals, but some of the details are missing. And China, even though they're leading in renewables, they're still heavily reliant on coal, right?
That's right. So both the U.S. and China, the biggest emitters, they've got work to do.
A lot of work to be done, clearly. Speaking of working together, let's talk about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. International cooperation, carbon markets, all that.
Article 6, full of potential, but also a bit of a headache.
Can you break it down for us? What are carbon markets all about?
Basically, countries can trade emissions reductions. If one country does better than their target, they can sell those extra reductions, called credits, to another country struggling to meet theirs.
So it's like a global emissions trading system?
Exactly. Incentivize emissions cuts where they're cheapest, speed things up globally, theoretically. But figuring out the rules, that's been a nightmare.
I can imagine. What are some of the sticking points?
Double counting, for one. You got to make sure a single emissions reduction isn't claimed by both the buyer and the seller.
Right. That would mess up the whole system. So how do you prevent that?
You need super strict accounting rules, global consensus on how they work, and that's tricky.
I bet.
Then there's fairness, especially between rich and poor countries. Developing countries, they worry this will benefit wealthy nations more.
Meaning?
Rich countries could just buy credits instead of cutting their own emissions, basically a loophole to avoid responsibility.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
And then there's the question of what to do with old carbon credits from the Kyoto Protocol, the previous agreement.
All those pre-existing credits,
Mhm.
what happens to them? Do they just vanish?
Probably not completely, but there's a push to, reform them. Some say allowing them into the Paris Agreement market would flood it with cheap credits and
Wouldn't reflect real emissions cuts.
exactly undermine the whole system.
And then there's the debate about, like, the quality of new credits.
Yeah. Huge debate. What makes a high-quality credit? What guarantees are there? Take a tree planting project. It can generate credits, but will those trees even survive, keep absorbing carbon for decades?
Yeah, how do you guarantee the impact will last? This carbon market stuff sounds like a minefield.
It is. And then there's the question of balancing these market solutions with, other approaches.
Like what?
Some people, they think these market mechanisms like trading are the best way to drive investment, cut emissions. Others say, no, we need more collaborative approaches.
So like what? Sharing technology, building capacity, giving developing countries direct financial support.
Exactly. It's like two different philosophies of how to cooperate on this.
Finding common ground, I imagine, is not easy.
Not easy at all. And all this was front and center at COP29 in Baku. A lot of debate, a lot of tension.
So any updates from COP29, specifically about Article 6?
Well, there was a breakthrough, actually. They finally agreed on standards for a centralized carbon market under the UN.
Wow, that's big news.
Huge step forward after over a decade of arguing. But, the devil's in the details.
It always is.
How these standards will actually be implemented, how this market will work in practice, that's all still being figured out.
So one step forward, but the journey's not over. Seems like with the Paris Agreement, every answer just leads to more questions.
That's climate change for you. Complex, multifaceted.
All right, before we get totally lost in the weeds, let's talk about money, because you know what they say.
Money talks.
Exactly. We've talked emissions, but where does finance fit into all of this?
Well, Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, that's all about climate finance. It basically says, look, developing countries need financial help to tackle climate change.
It's not just about setting targets, it's about giving them the means to actually meet those targets.
Right. Developed countries, they pledged to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing nations with mitigation and adaptation.
That's a lot of money. Did they actually reach that goal?
Not consistently, no, and that's caused a lot of tension, a lack of trust between developed and developing countries.
That's disheartening. I mean, lack of funding, that's a major roadblock.
It is. The ambition of the Paris Agreement, it needs to be backed up by real money.
Speaking of money, I've heard about green and dark green initiatives. What's the difference?
Think of it as a spectrum. Green is generally good. It's stuff like renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable transport. Dark green goes further, much bigger, lasting positive impact.
So green is good, dark green is like the gold standard.
You got it.
What are some examples of dark green initiatives?
Think carbon capture and storage, protecting and expanding forest, those next-level renewable systems that can power entire grids reliably.
Those are game changers. But how do you tell the difference? Is there a guidebook or something?
The European Union, they're leading the way here. They have regulations like the SFDR and the EU taxonomy, all about identifying what's truly dark green.
SFDR, EU taxonomy. Break those down for me.
Okay, so the SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, it makes financial institutions categorize their products based on how much they consider sustainability. 3 categories: don't care, kinda care, and the dark green ones where sustainability is the whole point.
So it helps investors find funds that are actually genuinely doing good.
Exactly. And then the EU taxonomy, it defines what counts as a sustainable economic activity, like super specific, with thresholds for performance and 6 key environmental objectives.
6. What are they?
Climate change, mitigation and adaptation, sustainable water and marine resources, circular economy, pollution control, and protecting biodiversity.
Wow, they thought of everything. So how does something get classified as sustainable under this taxonomy?
3 things. It has to contribute to at least one of those objectives, not harm any of the others, and meet social safeguards like human rights and labor standards.
So it's not just about the planet, it's about people too.
Exactly. And they have another regulation, the CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, makes companies report on their sustainability in detail.
The EU is really serious about this.
They are, and all this is connected to those ESG frameworks, environmental, social, and governance.
Right, ESG, it's everywhere these days.
Investors use those frameworks to assess companies, make sure they're actually sustainable, and hold them accountable.
So it's about transparency, knowing where your money's going and what it's actually doing.
Exactly. And it all ties back to Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, that climate finance piece. These EU regulations, they're helping ensure that money is going to projects that are actually sustainable, aligned with what the Paris Agreement is trying to achieve.
It's good to see those safeguards being put in place.
Yeah.
But I imagine identifying and verifying these dark green initiatives, it's not always straightforward.
It's not. There are challenges.
Like what?
Well, greenwashing, for one. Companies pretending to be eco-friendly when they're not.
So how do you stop that?
It's an ongoing battle.
Yeah.
Clear standards, certifications, transparency, independent verification, all of that helps.
And then aligning these initiatives with different countries' policies, that can't be easy either.
Right. You need global cooperation to make sure those dark green investments are going where they'll have the biggest impact. It's complex, but progress is happening.
Good to hear. So we've covered a lot, the big picture of the Paris Agreement, the carbon markets, the dark green investments. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? The Paris Agreement, it has its flaws.
It does. It's a landmark agreement, but it's not perfect.
What are some of the biggest issues we need to be aware of?
Well, for starters, those national pledges, the NDCs, they're not legally binding.
Wait, so a country could just ignore its commitments and, nothing happens?
Technically, yes. There's no real enforcement mechanism, no penalties if a country backslides or even pulls out of the agreement.
So it relies on goodwill, peer pressure. For a global crisis, that seems a little
precarious. I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
And then there's transparency, the enhanced transparency framework. It's supposed to improve reporting, but it still relies on countries self-reporting their data.
And how reliable is that, really?
Yeah.
I mean, countries could underreport their emissions, exaggerate their progress.
It happens. That's why we need better ways to verify that data. Some are suggesting independent verification, like bringing in outside experts to double-check.
Makes sense.
Another issue, carbon markets, Article 6, those negotiations are still a mess. Lots of technicalities, conflicting interests.
It seems like they're always getting bogged down in the details.
It's a symptom of how divided we are in this issue, how complex it is. And beyond that, the agreement relies on some technologies that aren't quite ready yet, like large-scale carbon capture. It's a bit of a gamble.
Betting on future tech to fix a present problem. Yeah, I see the risk. And we can't forget the money issue. Developed countries haven't met their climate finance pledges.
Right, and even when money is pledged, there's no guarantee it's being used effectively.
Like, what do you mean?
Some climate finance might not actually be going to projects that reduce emissions or help with adaptation. It's greenwashing, but with money instead of words.
So transparency and accountability, they're really important things here.
They're crucial. If the Paris Agreement is going to work, we need trust, and that comes from transparency.
Well, this has been eye-opening, to say the least. The Paris Agreement, it's a landmark, but it's got its flaws.
It does.
We've seen the mechanisms, the challenges, the questions about whether it's even enough, but we're not done yet.
Not even close. Back again, still digging into the Paris Agreement. We spent some time on the downsides, but it's like the foundation, right? We need this framework.
It's easy to get lost in the technical stuff, the critiques.
Yeah.
But yeah, Paris Agreement, it brought everyone together, right? Acknowledged this climate change thing is urgent, set some big goals.
Exactly. And those goals, they're tough, but they're not impossible. Since 2015, things have shifted in a good way.
Give us the good news. What kind of shifts?
Renewables, the cost has just plummeted. They're competing with fossil fuels now, head to head. Electric cars, booming market. More and more countries are setting those net zero targets.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. There's some momentum building.
Yeah.
It seems like the Paris Agreement, even if it's not perfect, it's gotten people talking, gotten things moving.
I think so, yeah. And it's not just the official stuff, the negotiations. Cities, businesses, individuals, they're all stepping up, making changes, cutting emissions.
It's like change from the bottom up, not just top down.
Exactly. And all that pressure, it's pushing governments and corporations to do more.
Speaking of doing more, we talked about Article 6, those carbon markets, and the challenges. What are some solutions people are proposing?
Lots of ideas out there. One big one is corresponding adjustments.
Corresponding adjustments, that sounds complicated.
It's about keeping things fair. Say a country sells a carbon credit, right? that represents some emissions reductions they've made. With corresponding adjustments, they have to adjust their own emissions accounting to show that they've traded those reductions away.
So they can't double dip, claim those reductions twice.
Right. It's about integrity, making sure the system isn't rigged.
Makes sense. Any other ways to make these carbon markets more, I don't know, trustworthy?
Registry systems, that's key. These registries track everything. Every carbon credit issued, transferred, retired.
So like a global ledger, making sure every credit is accounted for, no funny business.
Exactly. Transparency, security, that's how you prevent fraud. But then there's the quality issue. How do we know these credits are actually legit?
Right, that they're actually cutting emissions, not just hot air.
That's where verification comes in, third-party verification.
Yeah.
Independent experts come in, assess these carbon offset projects.
Making sure they meet high standards.
The highest, they look for environmental integrity and additionality.
Additionality.
It means the emissions reductions from the project, they wouldn't have happened otherwise. So like, if a project is funding a wind farm, they need to prove that wind farm wouldn't have been built without their money.
So it's about actually going above and beyond, not just getting credit for something that was already going to happen anyway.
Exactly. And then clear accounting guidelines, make sure everyone's measuring the same way, no creative accounting tricks.
This is a lot of work, building a carbon market that actually works.
It is, and it needs global buy-in. Countries have to work together, harmonize their systems, share best practices, build capacity.
Okay, so assuming we get these carbon markets working right, I know there are still skeptics out there. What are their concerns?
Good question. One big concern is that companies, even countries, could use these credits to avoid actually cutting their own emissions.
Like taking the easy way out. Instead of cleaning up their act, they just buy their way out of it.
That's the fear. And if that happens a lot, it defeats the purpose of the whole Paris Agreement, right? Which is to decarbonize globally.
So carbon markets, potential for good, but also potential for like backfiring if we're not careful.
Exactly. Strong rules, those verification mechanisms, all crucial. Carbon credits should be adding to real emissions cuts, not replacing them.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. But I think carbon markets, done right, can be a powerful tool to help us get where we need to be.
I'm glad you're optimistic. You mentioned earlier the gold standard, a real-world example of an organization trying to do carbon credits right.
Yeah, the gold standard, they're a certification body. They set the bar high for these carbon offset projects.
What makes them different? How do they operate?
They take a holistic view. It's not just about emissions, it's about sustainable development too. They want to see benefits for communities as well.
Like what kinds of benefits?
Biodiversity, better water management, helping communities thrive, creating jobs. They want these projects to have a positive impact all around.
So it's not just offsetting emissions, it's like doing good in the process.
Right, it's a more ethical approach. They've also tackled that double counting issue, better registry system, clear guidelines.
They're putting their money where their mouth is. Got any examples of a gold standard project?
Sure, there's one in Kenya providing clean cook stoves to families.
Cook stoves. How does that reduce emissions?
Traditional cook stoves, they burn wood or charcoal, lots of pollution, deforestation. These clean cook stoves are way more efficient, so less fuel, less emissions.
So it's healthier for the families and the planet.
Exactly. And it creates jobs, supports local businesses that make and distribute the cook stoves.
It's a win-win-win.
Exactly. The gold standard has certified thousands of projects like this all over the world. It shows the potential carbon markets can drive development, A&D, climate action.
It's good to have these examples, organizations showing that it can be done right. But even with the best standards, there's still that risk of misuse, right?
Always a risk. Greenwashing is a constant battle. Companies trying to look good without actually doing the work.
So healthy skepticism is still a good thing.
Absolutely. Ask questions, demand transparency, don't take things at face value.
Transparency is key. We need to know where the money's going, what impact it's actually having.
Agreed. And remember, carbon credits, they're just one tool in the toolbox. They're not the solution. They can't be an excuse for not reducing our own emissions.
Right. It's not about passing the buck. It's about shared responsibility. We need emissions cuts, carbon markets, new technologies, policy changes, and the individuals making different choices.
It's all connected. A complex challenge needs a comprehensive response. We're all in this together.
That we are. Well, this conversation about the Paris Agreement, carbon markets, it's been a lot. We've talked about rules, adjustments, verification, the good, the bad, and even those co-benefits, doing good while offsetting.
And we can't forget transparency, accountability, that healthy skepticism, making sure these markets are actually helping, not just, window dressing.
Right, exactly. This has been quite the journey, but we're not quite done yet.
Not quite. There's still more to explore.
All right, final part of our Paris Agreement deep dive. We've looked at the goals, the mechanisms, even poked at some of the weaknesses. But now the big question: what needs to happen to make this thing actually work, to really tackle this climate crisis?
The million-dollar question, right? And the stakes, they couldn't be higher. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change all over the world. And it's only going to get worse if we don't, seriously step up our game.
So where do we go from here? Top priorities for making the Paris Agreement stronger, faster, better.
Several things, but got to start with those NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. We talked about how the current pledges, they're just not enough not to stay below 1.5 degrees.
So countries need to be bolder, commit to bigger emissions cuts.
Absolutely. And it can't just be talk. It has to be action, real policies, changes on the ground. Targets are great, but we need to see them actually, walking the walk.
We talked about enforcement, or the lack of it, in the Paris Agreement. How do you fix that? How do you hold countries accountable?
That's tough, right? International law, it's tricky. But maybe a system of incentives and penalties, kind of like a carrot and stick approach.
How would that even work?
Imagine countries doing better than their targets, exceeding expectations, they get rewarded, access to climate finance, maybe better trade deals, and those lagging behind, well, maybe they face sanctions, tariffs on their exports.
Interesting. A global system of rewards and punishments. But would that actually get countries to take their commitments more seriously?
Worth exploring, right? But any system like that, it has to be fair, has to consider each country's situation, their capacity to make changes.
One size fits all probably won't work here. And what about transparency? Making sure countries are being honest about their emissions, their progress.
Right. The Enhanced Transparency Framework, the ETF, it's supposed to improve reporting, but
There's always a but.
it's still based on countries self-reporting their data.
And how reliable is that, really? We've seen countries underreport emissions, exaggerate their progress. It's a trust issue.
It is, and that's why we need better ways to verify that data, maybe independent verification, bring in outside experts to check those numbers, assess the real progress.
So double-checking their homework, basically.
Exactly. Adds accountability, makes it harder to fudge the numbers. But even with accurate data, even with enforcement, there's still the money question. Developed countries, they're not meeting their climate finance pledges.
Right. How do we fix that? How do we make sure that money is flowing and that it's actually being used effectively to help developing countries?
That's the core issue, right? Developed countries have to step up, deliver on that $100 billion a year promise. And we need to make sure that money is being used well, supporting projects that are actually, making a difference.
Is there any way to track that money, make sure it's being used properly?
There are some initiatives, but we need way more transparency. Maybe a global climate finance registry tracking every dollar, public and private, where it goes, what it does.
That would be huge, seeing the whole picture of the flow of money and its impact.
Exactly. And make it easier for developing countries to access those funds. The current system, it's bureaucratic, it's slow, it's a barrier for those who need help the most.
Cut the red tape, get the resources where they're needed.
Exactly. And not just for mitigation, but for adaptation too, for technology transfer, building capacity. It's a complex problem, needs a multi-pronged approach.
We spent a lot of time on the challenges, the potential downsides of the Paris Agreement. But got in on a positive note, right? What gives you hope that we can actually make this work?
Despite everything, I am optimistic. People are waking up, seeing the urgency. Young people especially, they're demanding action. Businesses are getting on board, investing in clean tech. Sustainability is becoming the norm. And the technology, it's advancing so fast, there's real potential for a cleaner future.
So a shift in mindset, a global movement building.
I believe so. And the Paris Agreement, flawed as it is, it's been a catalyst. It's brought us together, given us a framework, set ambitious goals. It's a reminder that even with huge challenges, there's always hope, especially when we work together.
Well said. The Paris Agreement, it's not the end, it's the beginning. And the story's still being written.
And we all have a role to play in that story, in shaping the future we want, for ourselves, for our kids, for everyone.
This deep dive, it's been a wild ride into the world of the Paris Agreement. The challenges, the complexities, the potential solutions, It's a lot to unpack.
We went deep on the negotiations, the carbon markets, climate finance, the tech, all of it. And we kept coming back to those core themes: transparency, accountability, individual action. Those are essential if this agreement is going to succeed.
This has been eye-opening, to say the least, but we're at the end of our deep dive, folks.
Thanks for sticking with us. It's a complex topic, but hopefully you've learned something. Maybe it sparked your curiosity. Maybe you'll even get involved in this fight for a better future.
Because knowledge is power, right?
Right.
The more we understand this stuff, the better equipped we are to find solutions, build the world we want.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
And remember, the future is not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make every single day.